$250,000. My HOA just slapped me with the most ridiculous fine in neighborhood history for violations on my own property. Are you absolutely kidding me right now? I've been living here for 30 years, minding my own business, and suddenly, these people are telling me I'm trespassing on community land. These million-dollar mansion owners with their perfect lawns and fancy cars think they can intimidate a 71-year-old man into giving up everything he owns. The biggest mistake of their lives, what I discovered when I decided to fight back, is going to completely blow your mind and destroy their perfect little bubble forever. Trust me when I say you have never seen revenge this absolutely satisfying. Drop a comment below. Has your HOA ever tried to pull something this outrageous on you? That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was out back checking on my chickens when I heard the mail truck rumble down our quiet street. Nothing unusual there, except when I walked to the mailbox, there was this thick certified letter waiting for me. The return address said Sunset Hills Homeowners Association in fancy gold lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. My gut told me this wasn't going to be good news, but I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole would go. The envelope was heavy professional looking, the kind that screams expensive lawyers from a mile away. I stood there in my driveway looking at this thing like it might bite me when Betty Harris from across the street waved and called out, "Morning mail, bringing good news, Walter." If only she knew. Inside that envelope was a violation notice that made my blood pressure spike faster than a jackrabbit in July. They were fining me $250,000 for 3 major violations: illegal fence placement beyond property line, unauthorized structures in community setback area, and encroachment on designated green space. Now, I've been around long enough to smell bullshit from 3 counties away, and this was grade A premium manure. My fence had been in the exact same spot for 30 years, right where my father built it, back when this whole area was nothing but farmland and dreams. The unauthorized structures they were talking about: my tool shed chicken coop, and the little gazebo my late wife Jane loved to sit in every evening. As for encroachment on designated green space, that was my vegetable garden where I'd been growing tomatoes since before most of these mansion owners knew what real dirt looked like. But here's where it gets interesting, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this part. Within 2 hours of my opening that letter, Sophia Blackstone herself came marching across my yard like she owned the place. And I mean literally marching. This woman was wearing designer heels that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, clicking across my gravel driveway with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged life. She had 2 other HOA board members trailing behind her like royal attendants, and she was carrying this official-looking clipboard like it was some kind of magic wand that could make my property disappear. The look on her face, pure disdain, like she was examining something nasty she'd scraped off her shoe. "Mr. Harrison," she announced without so much as a good morning, "I'm here to document these violations personally before we proceed with legal action." She started walking around my modest little property, pointing at my fence, my garden shed, my chicken coop, declaring everything a violation of community standards and encroachment on HOA maintained areas. I'm standing there watching this performance, feeling my temper rise like steam from a tea kettle. This woman was telling me that structures that had been on my property since before she probably even lived in this state were somehow illegal. When I pulled out my original property papers from 1973 to show her where my boundaries actually were, she dismissed them with a wave of her manicured hand. "Those old papers are irrelevant," she said with the kind of authority that comes from never having to back up your words with facts. "We have modern surveys showing community boundaries. You're clearly trespassing on a HOA property." And that's when Betty came over, bless her heart, and confirmed she remembered my fence being in that exact same spot for the 25 years she'd lived across the street. But Sophia just smiled that cold smile and said we were both confused about the updated property lines. She threatened legal action property liens and forced sale if I didn't comply within 30 days. Now, most folks my age might have been intimidated by all that legal talk and expensive suits, but I didn't spend 45 years in construction without learning how to spot a con artist. Something about this whole situation was setting off every alarm bell in my professional instincts, especially when I noticed the violation notice referenced a survey from 2010, 5 years after these mansions were built. Why would you need a new survey after the houses were already up? As a retired surveyor, I knew that the $250,000 fine required immediate legal attention. So I called my old friend Jim Patterson, who'd handled property law for 30 years. He took one look at those violation papers and whistled low. "Walter," he said, "you need to get an independent survey done yesterday. Something about this smells fishier than low tide." He recommended getting a comprehensive boundary survey to prove my property lines were exactly where I claimed they were. That evening, I went out to my garage and dusted off equipment I hadn't touched since retirement, GPS units, measuring tools, metal stakes, all the professional gear that had been my livelihood for nearly half a century. If these people wanted to play games with property boundaries, they'd pick the wrong old man to mess with. I spent that first evening doing some preliminary measurements with my handheld GPS unit, and what I found made my hands shake with something between excitement and pure rage. My fence wasn't just in the right place, it was exactly where the original property corners should be down to the inch. Using my old metal detector, I started finding the original survey stakes, buried under all that fancy landscaping around the mansion boundaries. But here's what really got my attention. Those buried stakes suggested my property extended way beyond where my current fence line sat. Way beyond. And if that was true, then some very expensive structures might be sitting on land that belonged to me. I looked across at Sophia's mansion, with its infinity pool and tennis court, then at the other 4 palatial houses surrounding my modest little home, and started wondering if maybe I wasn't the one doing the trespassing after all. Walter discovers he's not fighting simple HOA harassment. He's about to uncover something that will turn his quiet retirement into the property battle of the century. But what Jake Miller finds buried under those perfectly manicured mansion gardens will shock everyone who thinks they know where the real property lines are. The next morning, I called Jake Miller, the best independent surveyor in 3 counties, and explained my situation. Jake's been in the business almost as long as I, and when I told him about those buried survey stakes and the suspicious timing of that 2010 survey, he got quiet for a long minute. "Walter," he finally said, "this sounds like the kind of mess that makes lawyers rich and homeowners poor. But if you're right about those boundaries, we're talking about something a lot bigger than fence disputes." He agreed to do a comprehensive 3-week survey of my entire 8 acres, using every piece of modern technology available. GPS base stations, laser measuring equipment, ground-penetrating radar, the whole 9 yards. If someone was trying to steal my land through legal paperwork, we were going to prove it with technology that doesn't lie. Week 1 was like watching a master craftsman at work. Jake set up his equipment with the precision of a brain surgeon, using my original 1970s ownership papers as the baseline for everything. We started with the property corners, comparing the recorded legal descriptions with GPS satellite positioning that's accurate to within inches. Every day brought new evidence that made my suspicions look less crazy and more like cold, hard fact. The GPS readings showed my property extended 50 to 75 feet beyond my current fence line in multiple directions, which meant I'd been living on just a fraction of the land I actually owned. But more importantly, it meant those fancy mansions might be sitting on property that belonged to me, not them. By week 2, Jake's metal detector was finding original iron survey stakes, buried 2 to 3 feet underground, hidden by decades of landscaping that had been designed to make people forget where the real boundaries were. I watched Sophia pacing around in her backyard, making phone calls and staring at us through her kitchen window, like we were planning to steal her silverware. She even came over one afternoon trying to sweet-talk Jake about his credentials and whether he was properly licensed for this kind of work. Jake just smiled and handed her his business card, pointing out the state surveyor seal and 20 years of professional experience. Her face went white when she realized she wasn't dealing with some hack with a measuring tape. The systematic revelation of what we were uncovering hit me like a freight train loaded with karma. Sophia's $300,000 infinity pool and tennis court, sitting entirely on my property, not even close to her actual boundary line. That 4-car garage Nathan Cross was so proud of with the circular driveway that looked like something from a car show built completely on my land. Elena Foster's $500,000 master bedroom wing with the bathroom bigger than my kitchen and that walk-in closet that could house a small family. Every square inch of it was on property that legally belonged to me. Jackson Murphy's outdoor kitchen setup that he used for those fancy dinner parties, complete with the pizza oven and entertainment area, my land. And Bethany Wells' manicured front lawn with the fountain and gazebo that looked like something from a magazine, all of it was on property I'd inherited from my father 50 years ago. Jake kept shaking his head as we documented each encroachment with GPS precision and professional photography. "Walter," he said after measuring Sophia's pool area, "in 20 years of surveying, I've never seen systematic trespassing this massive across multiple properties. This isn't accidental. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing when these houses went up." The scope of what we discovered was staggering: over $2 million worth of structures, landscaping, and improvements built on my 8 acres without my knowledge or permission. Every single mansion had expensive additions that crossed my actual property lines, some by significant distances. The most damning evidence came when Jake investigated that 2010 survey the HOA had referenced in their violation notice. It took some digging, but he tracked down the company that supposedly filed it, except the company had gone out of business in 2008, 2 years before the survey was allegedly conducted. The signatures on the document, they didn't match any licensed surveyors in the state database. The coordinates completely fabricated, designed to make it look like my property was much smaller than it actually was. Someone had created an entirely fake survey to justify stealing my land, and they'd been getting away with it for over a decade. Betty Harris turned out to be an invaluable witness to this whole scheme. She remembered the construction phase vividly, crews moving my original fence markers during the building process, telling neighbors they were updating boundary lines for the new development. She'd assumed it was all legal and above board because, well, who questions official-looking construction crews with permits and professional equipment? But now, seeing Jake's measurements and comparing them to her memories of where things used to be, the pieces were falling into place. My father's carefully placed boundary markers had been deliberately moved and buried to hide the fact that these wealthy homeowners were building their dream houses on someone else's land. The final week of surveying felt like Christmas morning every day, except instead of presents under the tree, we were unwrapping evidence that would change 5 families' lives forever. Jake completed his 40-page professional report with legal descriptions, coordinate systems, photographic evidence, and GPS verification using multiple satellite confirmations. The conclusion was undeniable. I legally owned portions of all 5 luxury mansions based on recorded property deeds that predated their construction by decades. Modern GPS technology was simply confirming what my father had known when he bought this land. Property lines don't change just because rich people want them to. Sophia's panic was becoming more obvious by the day. She hired her own attorney, threatened lawsuits against Jake's surveying company, demanded second opinions from other professionals, and started making noise about elderly people with failing memories and vindictive intentions. But Jake's equipment doesn't have opinions or grudges. It just measures truth. And the truth was about to make 5 very wealthy neighbors face the most expensive mistake of their lives. As I looked at that comprehensive survey report with its GPS coordinates and legal descriptions and photographic proof, I realized this quiet retirement was about to become anything but quiet. When Jake Miller finishes his final measurements and shows Walter the complete survey results, the old man's face goes pale. What they've discovered about who actually owns what isn't just shocking. It's about to make 5 very wealthy neighbors face the most expensive mistake of their lives. Echo Stories wants to know, are you watching this unfold from your own property? Drop a comment and let us know where you're following this wild ride. With Jake's 40-page survey report in my hands, I felt like I was holding a stick of dynamite with a very short fuse. The GPS coordinates, legal descriptions, and photographic evidence painted a picture so clear that even a blind man could see what had happened here. But I'm old enough to know that being right and proving you're right in a way that matters are 2 completely different things. I needed a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, and I needed one fast. Jim Patterson recommended his colleague Jane Mitchell, a sharp-tongued property attorney who had spent 20 years making developers wish they'd chosen different careers. Jane took one look at Jake's survey report and let out a whistle that could have called my chickens home from 3 counties over. "Walter," she said, leaning back in her leather chair, "this is either the biggest property rights case I've seen in 2 decades or the most elaborate fraud attempt in state history. But based on these GPS measurements and your original deeds, I'd bet my law degree that you own exactly what these surveys say you own." She explained that recorded property deeds are like constitutional law in the real estate world. They supersede HOA bylaws, neighborhood agreements, and even city zoning if the paperwork is older and properly filed. My 1973 deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was legal gospel that had been gathering dust while millionaires built swimming pools on my land. The historical research Jane conducted painted an even more damning picture of what had happened during the construction boom 15 years ago. Those building permits for the mansions had been approved using boundary information that didn't match the county recorder's office records. Someone in the development company had submitted falsified property surveys to get approval for construction that extended well beyond the actual lot lines. The county recorder confirmed that my original deed was authentic, properly recorded, and had never been legally modified or challenged. Meanwhile, that mysterious 2010 survey that started this whole mess, complete fabrication filed by a shell company with ties to the original development contractor. While I was building my legal fortress, Sophia was launching her own offensive that would have made General Patton proud. She filed noise complaints when my rooster crowed at dawn. Apparently 6 in the morning was too early for wealthy people to wake up. She reported my chicken coop to code enforcement as an agricultural violation in a residential zone. She even had the nerve to call the health department about unsanitary conditions because I composted my kitchen scraps. Every day brought a new certified letter, a new violation, notice, a new threat. The woman was throwing everything she had at me, hoping something would stick, long enough to make me give up and sell out. But here's what Sophia didn't understand about dealing with old construction guys. We're like cockroaches, hard to kill and impossible to intimidate. Every harassment letter she sent just made me more determined to see this through to the bitter end. Betty Harris became my unofficial intelligence officer, keeping track of which board members were visiting Sophia's house for emergency meetings, and reporting back on the increasingly frantic phone calls she could hear through the walls. The desperation was becoming obvious. These people had built their dream homes partially on stolen land, and now they were facing a nightmare that could cost them everything. The community was starting to take notice of our 3-week surveying project and all the drama surrounding it. Betty had been quietly spreading the word about what Jake's measurements revealed, and the reactions were as divided as you'd expect in a neighborhood where property values determine social status. Some of the longtime residents who remembered the construction phase were nodding their heads, saying they always wondered about those boundary adjustments. But the newer residents, especially those friendly with the HOA board, were closing ranks and treating me like I was some kind of senile old man having delusions about property ownership. Jake's additional research into the development company that built these mansions revealed a pattern that made my skin crawl. They'd used similar tactics in 3 other developments across the state, filing fraudulent surveys, moving boundary markers during construction, then creating HOA agreements that made the illegal land grabs look legitimate. In each case, they'd targeted elderly property owners who were less likely to fight expensive legal battles, eventually buying them out for below-market prices after years of harassment. I wasn't their first victim. I was just their first victim who happened to be a professional surveyor with 45 years of experience reading property maps. Sophia's desperation reached new heights when she showed up at my door with a cashier's check for $50,000, offering to settle this misunderstanding and avoid unnecessary legal costs for everyone involved. She stood there in my doorway, check in hand, with that fake smile wealthy people use when they're trying to buy their way out of trouble. "Walter," she said in her most condescending voice, "surely we can resolve this like civilized adults. This is a generous offer for a simple boundary dispute." I looked at that check, then looked at her, then said the words that probably sealed both our fates. "Lady, I don't take money from people who've been stealing my land for 15 years. If anyone's paying anyone, it's going to be you paying me for using my property without permission." And the chess pieces were moving into position for what I knew would be the final battle. Sophia announced an emergency HOA meeting to address my continued violations and harassment of board members, clearly hoping to turn community pressure against me before the truth came out. But I was ready for that fight. Jake had prepared a visual presentation that would make the property boundaries clear to anyone with eyes to see. We had maps, photographs, GPS demonstrations, and legal documents that told a story no amount of money or influence could rewrite. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community center, and I spent the weekend reviewing every piece of evidence, knowing this would be my one chance to expose the truth to the entire neighborhood. As I sat in my kitchen that Sunday night, looking at those survey maps spread across my table, I thought about what my father would say if he could see this mess. He'd taught me that property ownership was one of the fundamental rights that separated free men from serfs, and that standing up for those rights was worth any amount of trouble it might cause. Tuesday's meeting was going to determine whether 15 years of theft would continue, or whether an old surveyor with a GPS unit could prove that justice doesn't have an expiration date. Walter has all the proof he needs, but what happens when he walks into that HOA meeting with a folder full of GPS coordinates and legal documents? Will Sophia's arrogance finally meet its match, or does the queen bee have one last sting ready? The answer will determine who really owns those million-dollar pools and garages. Tuesday evening came faster than a summer thunderstorm, and I'll admit my hands were shaking slightly as I loaded my presentation materials into the truck. Not from fear, hell no, but from anticipation. After 3 weeks of measurements and months of harassment, I was finally going to show this community exactly who'd been stealing from whom. The community center parking lot was already packed when I arrived, with more cars than I'd seen at any HOA meeting in the 15 years since these people moved in. Word had gotten around about the property dispute, and apparently half the neighborhood wanted front row seats for what they expected to be my public humiliation. Sophia had transformed the community center into something resembling a courtroom, complete with a head table for the 5 board members, a microphone system, and even a projector screen that I'm sure she planned to use for displaying my violations. She was wearing what looked like a $1,000 business suit, flanked by 2 expensive-looking attorneys with briefcases that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The other 4 board members sat beside her like judges at a tribunal, all of them wearing expressions that suggested they were about to watch an execution. Nathan Cross kept checking his Rolex, Elena Foster was shuffling through official-looking documents, Jackson Murphy was whispering to one of the lawyers, and Bethany Wells looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I walked in carrying just my old survey briefcase, and Jake's GPS unit took a seat in the back row like I was attending church, and waited for the show to begin. Sophia's opening presentation was a masterpiece of manipulation. Enlarged photographs of my violations, legal citations about property maintenance standards, expert testimony from their HOA attorney about the serious consequences of challenging community authority. She painted me as a confused elderly man who was disrupting neighborhood harmony because he couldn't accept modern property management. The audience was nodding along, clearly convinced that this old surveyor had finally lost his marbles and was causing trouble for these successful law-abiding homeowners. Each board member took their turn describing how my violations were affecting their quality of life and property values. Nathan complained about my rooster disturbing his sleep. Apparently, the sound of livestock was beneath the dignity of his 4-car garage. Elena worried that my vegetable garden was attracting undesirable wildlife that might damage her pristine landscaping. Jackson claimed my tool shed was an eyesore that lowered the aesthetic standards of the entire community. Bethany expressed concern about safety issues related to my chicken coop. Their HOA attorney wrapped up by explaining the legal consequences I would face if I continued these frivolous challenges to community authority, making it sound like I was one step away from federal prison. When Sophia finally called my name to respond, the room got so quiet you could hear my arthritis creaking as I stood up. I walked to the front, slowly set up Jake's laptop, connected it to their projector, and unpacked the GPS unit like I was preparing for surgery. "Folks," I said, looking out at 25 faces that expected to see me beg for mercy, "I've been a professional surveyor for 45 years. Tonight you're going to learn the difference between accusations and actual measurements." The first image that appeared on their screen was a drone photograph of the entire neighborhood, with bright red lines showing the GPS-verified property boundaries overlaid on top of the mansions. The collective gasp from the audience sounded like air being let out of a giant balloon. Those red lines cut directly through swimming pools, garages, master bedrooms, and manicured lawns, making it impossible to ignore what the measurements revealed. I clicked to the next slide showing Sophia's infinity pool and tennis court, with GPS coordinates confirming that every square inch sat on my property. "Mrs. Blackstone," I said, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, "your $300,000 pool, that's my backyard." Her face went from confident to confused to pale as paper in about 3 seconds. Jake Miller's professional credentials appeared next on the screen. State licensing, 20 years of experience, GPS certification member, in good standing with the Professional Surveyors Association. Then came the systematic revelation that turned the entire meeting upside down. Nathan's garage and circular driveway completely on my land. Elena's master bedroom wing built on property that belonged to me. Jackson's outdoor kitchen and entertainment area sitting on land I'd inherited from my father. Bethany's front lawn and decorative fountain, my property. Each revelation was accompanied by GPS coordinates, professional photographs, and legal descriptions that made arguing with the facts impossible. The fake survey that started this whole mess came next, and I watched the board members' faces change from confusion to panic as Jake's forensic analysis appeared on screen. The surveyor's signatures were forged. The company had been out of business for years, and the coordinates were completely fabricated to make my property appear smaller than it actually was. "Someone," I said, letting my eyes sweep across the head table, "created an entirely false survey to justify stealing my land, and they've been getting away with it for over 15 years. Betty Harris stood up from the audience and confirmed everything I was saying, describing how she remembered the construction crews, moving boundary markers, and telling neighbors they were updating property lines for the new development. Other longtime residents began nodding and sharing their own memories of that construction period, painting a picture of systematic deception that had fooled an entire community. The mood in the room was shifting from skepticism to shock to outright anger as people realized they'd been living next to the biggest property theft in county history. Sophia's desperate attempts to challenge my evidence fell apart faster than a house of cards in a tornado. Her attorney tried arguing that GPS technology was unreliable, but I pulled out my handheld unit and demonstrated live coordinates that matched the original survey stakes to within inches. They claimed the old property deeds were irrelevant, but my lawyer explained that recorded deeds supersede HOA bylaws, regardless of when the association was formed. When Sophia accused me of being a senile old man trying to steal their homes, I simply pointed to the screen and said, "GPS coordinates don't have opinions, and mathematics doesn't lie." The meeting dissolved into chaos as board members frantically made phone calls to attorneys. Residents argued among themselves about what this meant for property values, and Sophia demanded that everyone stop believing these ridiculous claims, despite the evidence displayed in high-definition color on the wall behind her. I packed up my equipment calmly while the storm raged around me, knowing I'd accomplished exactly what I came to do. The truth was out, and no amount of money or influence could stuff it back into the bottle. The truth is out. The GPS coordinates don't lie, and 5 mansion owners just learned their worst nightmare has come true. But when people with million-dollar homes face losing parts of them to a 71-year-old retired surveyor, exactly how far will they go to protect their investments? What Sophia does next will either save her empire or destroy it completely. The morning after that explosive HOA meeting, my phone started ringing before the rooster had finished his wake-up call. Jane Mitchell was calling, with news that Sophia had hired the most expensive property litigation firm in the state, the kind of lawyers who charge more per hour than most people make in a week. "Walter," she said, "they're not messing around. We're looking at a legal war that could drag on for months, maybe years. Are you prepared for that kind of fight?" I thought about my late wife Jane, who used to say that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost, and told my attorney to file whatever paperwork was necessary to protect my rights. Jane filed a formal property boundary dispute with the county superior court, requesting a declaratory judgment about ownership rights based on recorded deeds and professional surveys. Within 48 hours, Sophia's legal team fired back with a countersuit claiming fraud, harassment, elder abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They were throwing every legal theory they could think of at me, hoping something would stick long enough to make me give up. The filing fees alone were costing me more money than I'd spent on anything since my wife's funeral. But sometimes principle is worth more than financial comfort. The discovery phase felt like having dental work performed by lawyers instead of dentists. Both legal teams demanded documents, depositions, expert witness testimony, surveyor qualifications, and 50 years of historical property records. I spent hours answering questions about my mental competency, my motivations for challenging the HOA, and whether I understood the serious consequences of my actions. Sophia's lawyers tried every trick in the book to paint me as a confused elderly man with failing memory and vindictive intentions, but they couldn't explain away GPS coordinates and recorded property deeds. By month 2, the media attention was getting intense enough to make me consider disconnecting my phone. The local news loved the David versus Goliath angle of an elderly surveyor taking on millionaire neighbors, and the story had started spreading beyond our little community. Property rights advocacy groups were calling to offer support. Other elderly homeowners were reaching out with their own HOA horror stories, and real estate attorneys from 3 states wanted to discuss similar cases they'd handled. I never asked to become the poster child for property rights, but sometimes life pushes you into roles you never expected to play. The expert witness battles turned into a clash between old-school surveying knowledge and expensive legal theories. Sophia hired a competing surveyor who tried to challenge Jake's GPS methodology, claiming that satellite positioning wasn't accurate enough for boundary disputes and that traditional surveying methods should take precedence over modern technology. Jake's response was devastating. He brought in GPS technology experts who explained how satellite positioning works, demonstrated the accuracy of his equipment, and showed that his measurements matched the original property stakes to within inches. When science goes up against wishful thinking, science wins every time. Month 4 brought settlement negotiations that felt more like hostage exchanges than legal discussions. Sophia's team offered increasingly desperate deals. First, $50,000 to resolve this misunderstanding, then $100,000, finally reaching $200,000 for me to sign away any claims to the encroached property. Each offer came with veiled threats about the costs of continued litigation and warnings about elderly people who get in over their heads with legal battles. I turned down every offer with the same response: I don't sell my property to people who stole it in the first place. The financial pressure was real, I won't lie about that. My legal bills had climbed past $75,000, forcing me to dip into savings I'd planned to leave for my grandchildren. But every time I considered giving up, I'd walk out to my fence line and look at those mansion additions sitting on my land, and my resolve would harden like concrete in summer heat. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about whether property rights mean anything when rich people decide they want what you own. Month 6 brought pretrial motions that felt like watching lawyers play chess with million-dollar stakes. Arguments about evidence admissibility, expert witness qualifications, surveyor methodology standards, and whether GPS technology should be considered legally binding in property disputes. The local surveyor association filed a friend of court brief supporting my case, arguing that GPS surveying represents the highest standard of accuracy available to the profession. Property rights advocacy groups joined in claiming that allowing wealthy defendants to ignore recorded deeds would undermine the entire foundation of property ownership in America. Sophia's desperation was becoming more obvious as her legal options dwindled. She made one final attempt to buy her way out of trouble, offering $2 million for my 8 acres, nearly 4 times what the land would normally be worth. Walter, her lead attorney, said during our last settlement conference, "This is an extraordinarily generous offer for property that's been assessed at $500,000. Surely you can see the wisdom of accepting this and avoiding the uncertainty of trial." I looked across the conference table at Sophia, who was trying to maintain her composure while facing the possibility of losing parts of her dream home, and delivered my final answer. This was never about money. My property lines don't change because rich people build expensive houses on them. The trial preparation in month 8 felt like getting ready for the Super Bowl, if the Super Bowl was decided by GPS coordinates and property deeds instead of touchdowns. Final witness lists exhibit preparation and jury selection for what had become the most closely watched property rights case in state history. The local courthouse was expecting crowds, media coverage, and observers from legal organizations across the region. Jake had prepared a comprehensive testimony about GPS methodology and professional surveying standards. Jane had assembled a presentation that would walk the jury through 50 years of property ownership, from my father's original purchase through the fraudulent survey that started this whole mess. As I sat in my kitchen the night before trial looking at survey maps spread across the table where my wife used to serve Sunday dinner, I felt the weight of what we were about to attempt. We were challenging some of the wealthiest people in the county, people with resources to fight legal battles that could bankrupt ordinary folks. But we had something they couldn't buy: the truth backed by GPS satellites and recorded property deeds that had been waiting 50 years for someone to defend them. The legal battle lines are drawn, expensive lawyers are hired, and 8 months of courtroom warfare await. But in property disputes, this big, anything can happen. Evidence can disappear, witnesses can change their stories, and even GPS coordinates can be challenged. Will Walter's simple truth survive the legal onslaught from 5 desperate millionaires? Or is the retired surveyor about to learn that money really can buy justice? The courtroom drama is just beginning. The morning of the trial, the county courthouse looked like the site of a major celebrity scandal rather than a property dispute between neighbors. Media vans lined the street, property rights advocates had organized a rally on the courthouse steps, and curious onlookers were already claiming seats in the gallery by 7 in the morning. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and wondering how a simple boundary disagreement had turned into what the newspapers were calling the property rights case of the decade. My hands were steady, though. 45 years of reading surveys and standing up to construction bosses had prepared me for bigger fights than this one. Judge Margaret Chen had 20 years of experience with property law, and her reputation for cutting through legal nonsense gave me confidence that we'd get a fair hearing. Her opening remarks made it clear she understood the significance of the case. This dispute will establish important precedents about GPS technology in boundary determination and the legal weight of recorded property deeds versus modern development practices. Sophia's legal team had filled the front row, 3 attorneys in $1,000 suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else than arguing against satellite technology and recorded deeds. Sophia's lawyers opened with their best shot, arguing that my survey was flawed, GPS technology was unreliable for boundary disputes, and that practical considerations should outweigh technical measurements when expensive homes were involved. Their expert witness claimed that GPS coordinates could drift over time, that surveyor measurements contained unavoidable errors, and that property boundaries had evolved through decades of accepted use. They painted me as a confused elderly man using outdated legal theories to threaten the homes and investments of law-abiding citizens who'd trusted professional developers and legal documentation. Jane Mitchell's opening statement cut through their arguments like a chainsaw through butter. She explained how GPS technology works, using multiple satellites and ground control points to achieve accuracy within inches far more precise than any surveying method available when these properties were originally platted. Jake Miller's expert testimony was devastating. He demonstrated live GPS coordinates in the courtroom, showed how his equipment matched original survey stakes that had been buried for decades, and explained why satellite positioning represents the gold standard for modern boundary determination. The smoking gun came when Jake presented his forensic analysis of that fake 2010 survey. The coordinates were mathematically impossible. The surveyor's signatures belonged to people who had been dead for years, and the company that allegedly filed the document had been out of business when the survey was supposedly conducted. Your Honor, Jake testified, this document is not just inaccurate, it's a deliberate fabrication designed to make Mr. Harrison's property appear smaller than it actually is. The courtroom was dead silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a boundary dispute, it was evidence of systematic fraud. Betty Harris's testimony provided the historical context that tied everything together. She described watching construction crews move boundary markers during the mansion building phase, remembered conversations with workers who mentioned updating property lines for the new development, and confirmed that my fence had been in the same location for the 25 years she'd lived across the street. Her simple, honest account of what she'd witnessed carried more weight than hours of expert testimony, because she had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from the outcome. Sophia's testimony was a disaster that her expensive lawyers couldn't prevent. Under cross-examination, she couldn't explain how she'd determined my property boundaries without a legitimate survey, couldn't identify the source of the 2010 document her HOA had used to justify the violations, and couldn't account for why her organization had never contacted me before filing $250,000 in fines. When Jane asked her directly whether she'd known the 2010 survey was fraudulent when the HOA used it to justify my violations, Sophia's answer was a stammering non-response that convinced everyone in the courtroom she'd been caught red-handed. My own testimony felt like 45 years of professional experience speaking through me. I explained how GPS technology had revolutionized surveying accuracy, demonstrated the reliability of the equipment Jake had used, and walked the jury through the mathematical certainty of satellite positioning. When Sophia's attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive old man seeking revenge against successful neighbors, I looked directly at the jury and said, "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm simply defending property I inherited from my father, using the best technology available to prove where the boundaries actually are." The jury deliberation lasted 2 days, which felt like 2 years while we waited for their decision. Jane tried to keep me calm by explaining that property cases often require extensive discussion because the legal precedents affect so many other potential disputes. Jake spent the time reviewing his testimony and double-checking his measurements, even though we both knew the GPS coordinates were as solid as mathematical law. The media speculation was intense, with legal experts on both sides predicting outcomes based on everything from jury composition to the judge's previous rulings. When Judge Chen read the verdict, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd made a decision that would be remembered long after we were all gone. The court finds that GPS coordinates, when properly obtained by licensed professionals and verified against recorded property deeds, provide irrefutable evidence of boundary locations. Mr. Harrison's ownership of the disputed property is confirmed by a preponderance of evidence that cannot be reasonably challenged. The courtroom erupted in cheers from property rights supporters, while Sophia's legal team immediately began discussing appeal options with their stunned clients. The damage assessment phase determined that each mansion owner owed compensation for 15 years of unauthorized property use based on fair market rental values for the structures and improvements they'd built on my land. Sophia faced the choice of paying ongoing rental fees for her pool and tennis court, or removing improvements worth over $300,000. The other board members received similar options: pay rent for continued use, or demolish the portions of their homes that sat on my property. Judge Chen's final ruling established GPS surveying as the legal gold standard for boundary disputes and confirmed that recorded property deeds supersede all subsequent agreements or claims. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into a different world from the one I'd entered. Betty Harris was waiting with a crowd of supporters who'd followed the case from the beginning, neighbors who had finally learned the truth about those property boundaries, and legal advocates who saw my victory as validation for property rights across the country. The media attention was overwhelming, but the satisfaction of proving that an old surveyor with a GPS unit could defeat legal manipulation and wealthy influence was worth every minute of the 8-month battle. Justice has been served, the surveyor's measurements proved unshakable, and Walter Harrison has won the property battle of the century. But when you legally own parts of 5 mansions, and their owners must now pay you monthly rent, life is about to change in ways no retirement plan ever prepared him for. The victory is complete, but the real story of what happens when the tables turn completely, that's just getting started. Echo. Stories are curious. Where are you watching Walter's incredible journey unfold? Comment below and share your location. 1 year after that courthouse victory, I wake up every morning to the sound of my rooster Bob crowing over land that's legally, officially, and GPS verified mine. All 8 acres of it, including the parts where millionaires built their dream homes without asking permission. The rental checks arrive like clockwork on the 1st of every month. And I'll admit there's a special satisfaction in depositing $2,000 from Sophia Blackstone for the privilege of keeping her infinity pool on my property. The woman who once called me a senile old fool now writes my name on rent checks with the kind of precision she reserves for signing important legal documents. The rental agreements we negotiated turned out to be more reasonable than anyone expected, mainly because I'm not interested in revenge, just justice and fair compensation. Nathan Cross pays $1,500 monthly to keep his 4-car garage operational, which he grudgingly admits is cheaper than demolishing and rebuilding on his actual property. Elena Foster's $2,500 rent for her master bedroom suite comes with a lease agreement that's renewed annually, making me officially her landlord for the most expensive bedroom in the county. Jackson Murphy's $1,800 monthly fee for his outdoor kitchen allows him to continue hosting those fancy dinner parties, though the conversations now include regular updates about his unique landlord situation. Bethany Wells chose the most creative solution. She hired a landscaping company to relocate her fountain and gazebo to her actual property, then negotiated a $1,200 monthly lease for front yard access that ensures she can still reach her own front door. The work took 3 months and cost her nearly as much as 2 years of rent would have, but she said the principle of not paying rent to live in her own house was worth the expense. I respected her decision, even though it meant losing some monthly income, because she handled the situation with more class than the rest of the board combined. Betty Harris has become my unofficial property manager, helping coordinate maintenance issues and serving as a diplomatic buffer between me and my wealthy tenants. She's got a natural talent for keeping everyone focused on practical solutions rather than emotional grievances. When Sophia's pool pump needed major repairs last spring, Betty negotiated a cost-sharing agreement that saved everyone money and maintained neighborhood peace. Her vegetable garden has expanded onto part of my reclaimed property, and we've turned it into a community space where other neighbors can rent plots for their own organic farming experiments. The local media still checks in periodically for updates on the property rights case that changed everything, and I've gotten used to explaining how GPS technology proved what common sense should have prevented. Law schools across the region now teach the Harrison versus Sunset Hills case as an example of how modern surveying methods can resolve disputes that might have dragged through courts for decades using traditional techniques. Jake Miller's business has expanded dramatically with property owners from 3 states requesting GPS boundary surveys after hearing about our success. My speaking engagements at surveyor conventions and property rights conferences have introduced me to elderly homeowners facing similar situations nationwide. The pattern is depressingly familiar. Wealthy developers or aggressive HOAs targeting older property owners with harassment campaigns designed to force below-market sales. But now, there's a playbook for fighting back. Get professional GPS surveys, research historical property records, and don't let expensive lawyers intimidate you out of defending your rights. The technology exists to prove ownership beyond any reasonable doubt. You just need the courage to use it. The financial benefits of winning this battle have allowed me to upgrade my modest retirement lifestyle in ways I never expected. The new truck handles much better than my old pickup. The house renovations have made everything more comfortable, and I've been able to establish a scholarship fund for surveying students at the local technical college. But the most valuable change isn't financial. It's the respect I've earned from a community that initially saw me as a troublesome old man fighting against progress and prosperity. Sophia's transformation has been the most interesting development of all. The monthly rent payments seem to have taught her lessons about humility that 30 years of wealth and privilege never provided. She still lives in her mansion, still maintains her infinity pool, but her attitude toward neighbors has shifted dramatically. Last month, she actually asked my opinion about a property boundary question involving her backyard fence, treating my surveying expertise with the respect it should have received from the beginning. People can change when circumstances force them to confront the consequences of their actions. The annual GPS verification surveys Jake and I conduct have become neighborhood events with curious residents watching as we confirm that satellite technology still agrees with property boundaries established 50 years ago. Some of the newer homeowners have hired Jake to survey their own properties, discovering minor encroachments and easement issues that are much easier to resolve before they become legal battles. Prevention, as my wife used to say, is worth a pound of cure, especially when the cure involves 8 months of courtroom warfare. The property maintenance cooperation has created an unexpected sense of shared responsibility that's improved the entire neighborhood. My tenants take excellent care of the structures they rent on my land, understanding that proper upkeep protects their investments and keeps our business relationship friendly. I've learned more about pool chemistry and tennis court maintenance than any retired surveyor needs to know, but there's satisfaction in watching expensive improvements being properly maintained by people who now understand they're using someone else's property. Teaching weekend courses about GPS technology and property rights at the community college has introduced me to young people who see land surveying as an exciting career rather than an old man's outdated profession. Technology has revolutionized the field in ways that make boundary determination more accurate and legally defensible than ever before. These students understand that property rights form the foundation of economic freedom, and that surveying serves as the guardian of those rights. The quiet satisfaction of my daily routine now includes moments that would have been impossible to imagine 2 years ago. Morning coffee on the porch includes checking the maintenance of structures that my tenants built on my land. Evening walks along my fence line cover boundaries that GPS satellites confirm to mathematical certainty. The property that my father bought and my wife loved is now secured for whatever family members inherited, protected by legal precedents that will make future boundary disputes much harder to prosecute. From a $250,000 harassment letter to monthly rent checks from millionaires, sometimes the best defense against bullies is simply knowing your rights and having the courage to fight for them. My GPS unit and 45 years of surveying experience became the weapons that defeated wealth intimidation and legal manipulation. But more than that, this whole battle taught me that age doesn't make you powerless. It gives you wisdom that younger people haven't earned yet. The real lesson here isn't about property boundaries or surveying technology. It's about standing up when someone tries to steal what's rightfully yours, no matter how rich or powerful they think they are. Sophia and her board learned the hard way that property lines don't change just because you want them to, and that sometimes the quiet old guy next door knows exactly what he's doing. Here at Echo Stories, we believe that every David deserves to beat their Goliath, and Walter Harrison proved that age experience and simple honesty can triumph over wealth, intimidation, and legal manipulation. His story reminds us that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Whether you're dealing with corrupt HOAs, dishonest neighbors, or anyone trying to take what belongs to you, remember Walter's approach document. Everything know your rights, and never let bullies convince you to give up without a fight. If this story of sweet revenge and perfect justice got your blood-pumping smash, that like button and let us know in the comments what you think about Walter's incredible victory. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Did someone ever try to scam you out of your property? Share your own David versus Goliath stories below. We love hearing how ordinary people defeat extraordinary odds. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, where another underdog gets the last laugh. Until then, remember, know your boundaries, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that being right isn't worth fighting for. Hello from all of us at Echo Stories, and we'll catch you soon.